Stephen Balogh, welcome to Thinking Class. Thanks so much for joining me.
It's a great pleasure to be with you.
Well, it's my pleasure. You've been doing some interesting work of late, which saw you travel to Central Europe, Hungary to be specific, to deliver a talk on the state of democracy in Europe. And I think it's fair to say that if you glance at some of our papers, whether it's the Times, and you can hear from the likes of Fraser Nelson, the former editor of The Spectator, that we've never had it so good. We hear from historians that it's now that is the best time to be alive, but it doesn't always feel that way. And I think it's fair to say that there is a profound dissatisfaction amongst the populations of Western democracies. So, Stephen, have we never had it so good, or has democracy gone wrong somewhere along the line, and why?
Well, it's a truly fascinating question. Those of us who are either indirectly or directly steeped in politics, from whatever direction, as commentators or as participants, it feels as if that question is arising every day. There's a constant, I'll use the word, discombobulation between what we seem to be being told or convinced of, or people attempting to convince us, and our real experience, whether it is truly as just ordinary citizens going about our business, finding that, I don't know, the streets are less safe, the food prices are going up, energy bills are astronomical, and then the narrative, the political narrative that is the predominant one, seems to be completely at odds. So yes, I think there is something wrong. I don't think that today's quality of life is falling off a cliff, put it that way. But there is clearly an erosion. There's an erosion in tangible measures, such as, I don't know, GDP per head and all the rest of it, average earnings. But I think the bigger problem is the intangible thing that is harder for people to arrive at a consensus over. Now, democracy is supposedly the mechanism by which these things are discussed and resolutions are found. Or if there isn't a resolution, there's honesty in saying we're in a bit of a situation here. And I think democracy as a mechanism, as a machinery, on the face of it, is working well. One of the figures is that something like 4 billion people voted in elections last year around the world. So there is mass participation in elections, but the outcomes are not what people are expecting or hoping for, or a decreasing number are finding satisfaction in it. So that's where the mismatch is, yes.
The paper that you wrote, and I suppose we can reference it without it being available on demand for listeners and viewers, but you hinged your paper on a report from the Economist's Intelligence Unit, which effectively had said that democracy is broadly working okay. Some countries are a little bit more authoritarian than others, and they should do a bit less of that. And they were pointing to the usual suspects, pointing towards Hungary and some other Central and Eastern European countries. I think people can spot within the news cycle that perhaps that's a bit too much of an optimistic spin to put on it, given that we can see in our own country of the United Kingdom that Labour have delayed 2 rounds of local elections since they've come to power. They point to technical reasons for this, but likely they're doing so because they know they'd lose on current polling numbers. We've got German politicians and the political class that are attempting to ban the increasingly popular Alternative for Deutschland, the AfD, from running. We've had Belgium over many years putting a cordon sanitaire around the popular Vlaams Belang, they're also right-wing. National Rally is always attempted to be isolated in France as a demonization policy, keep them behind closed doors. Romania cancelled elections, and yet this same organization has said that democracy seems to be doing okay. Why do you think an organization that would do that kind of research would come out thinking that, when you could go and pick up the paper and find those examples quite easily?
So yes, I think. I mean, you mentioned the Economist Intelligence Unit. I want to give it a little bit of credit as well, because in its Democracy 2024 report, which came out, I think, in roughly February this year, it did actually go through quite an honest analysis of why there was such a mismatch between technocratic working of democracy, some of the exceptions that you're talking about, the edge cases, let's say, of parties which either they're inside the democratic perimeter or they're placed outside the democratic perimeter. I'd like to come back to that a little bit later in the conversation. But even the EIU in its report said this dissatisfaction is rising very sharply. It's been rising for 50 years on a steady gradient, and then there was a turning point, or at least an uptick in how quickly dissatisfaction was rising in the early part of this century, and very rapidly now. So it came up with, I think, quite an elegant framework, a sort of set of categories or areas of consideration. It talked about things like the choice deficit, where so many of the mainstream parties are largely converging on a technocratic ticket. So-called third way, maybe Tony Blair's famous third way, a sort of convergence of state and private interests and so on. Equally, a sort of choice deficit. When you look at the main parties' offerings in this country and elsewhere, they're not so very different. I think also, and we get into sort of cleavage politics, the parties are representing, I think, increasingly narrow sections of the overall population, leaving very large swathes effectively politically dispossessed. And even things like citizenship deficit, that's another category that they use. What is the participation in society of citizens by various measures, not just voting, but civic participation? One of the features of the last 15 years in this country, ironically, after the big society initiative of Cameron, is that volunteering has fallen off a cliff since about 2013, 2014. Many fewer people are engaging as citizens in civic activities for the betterment of the citizens around them. So it diagnoses that. There's one other large category, equality deficit, which broadly covers an economic malaise, a very, very obviously increasing disparities between the haves and the have-nots, which leads many people to look for very radical economic alternatives, bordering on Marxism and the like. So I like that framework. I took issue with it from the in my research, and the thing that is quite obvious is that there is an ideological underpinning to that categorization, which is a sort of a liberal conception of the individual as an atomized individual. They may be categorized as citizens, but they are citizens by dint of them having the vote or certain rights. It's not by dint of them being part of a group. And there is no measurement of sense of affiliation within a particular grouping, whether a nation or whatever the unit of governance is. And I think that by that missing, that's very telling. It is a missing part of the entire framework for assessment, which I think is a much deeper yearning inside individuals to have put right.
You and I have already mentioned that there's dissatisfaction. It's profound. And you said that for the last 50 years, it's been rising. And you've alluded to a few reasons as to why that might be. But what do you think it is about the last 50 years? And I appreciate there's lots to pick at there, whether it's the changing political landscape to the economics to the demographics and all of those things. But what do you think has been the driver behind this rising dissatisfaction, which doesn't seem to go away?
Goodness, well, I don't know quite whether there's a single underlying cause. So maybe it is a bunch of different features that may or may not be related to each other. One thing I do think, without necessarily wanting to become too overly philosophical about it, is this postmodern turn, which questions meaning fundamentally, questions structures, questions concepts, questions ideas. And I think one of the things I would observe personally is what I would call loss of narrative, the loss of the ability of politicians, leaders, to lay out a narrative, an inspiring narrative that touches the hearts as well as the minds of people. And if you can't offer a narrative, if you can't offer a story, I think then you're reduced to effectively sort of technical lists of ways in which you might experience life getting better, a little bit of an uptick in I don't know, the convenience of traveling or of other amenities, which satisfy people, in the minute, but don't give them a sense of belonging, a sense of progress, a sense of real participation, I suppose. So I think that's quite a deep and pervasive problem. And what it means also is all of the attempts of the politicians to inspire just rings hollow, sounds insincere. It sounds fabricated. Just to give a couple of an example. So one of the books that I touched on in my research was by Francois Faure, who was looking at the reasons why the attempts of the European Union to inspire people through narrative completely failed. He identified three distinct waves of narrative that the European Union has tried. One of them is a Europe of rights. So every citizen in the European Union has a certain right of values, attempting to come up with these mythical values that everyone instinctively, universal values that everyone wants to live by, or of the way of life, the practical way of life. And that's all founded. And a phrase I've just captured from Faure's narrative. He said, well, the reason why fundamentally is that the European Union is an elite-driven political process relying largely on technocracy and with very limited symbolic resources. So that to me was a very striking phrase, which actually I think you could port into the constituent countries, also Britain, and say, and if you think about the narratives over the last, I don't know, 20, 25, 30 years, I think in Britain, say maybe from the major government onwards, there was a loss of narrative and the inability to use the symbolic resources that might previously have been available. Things like patriotism, things like tradition, things like a sense of neighborliness. I don't know. And I think I do think that's quite pervasive. But I think alongside that, I'll throw one more thing and then pause, is that I think there's a lack of political honesty. So within my party, the SDP, we've been thinking a lot obviously about political honesty and how, and the things that have gone wrong as a result of it, the loss of a capability to do planning long term, for instance. So everything becomes much more short-term, consumption-based, extractive, rather than investing truly for the future. And that's one of the themes that we're thinking about. And I think by trying to satisfy very near-term desires, I think that is almost the micro version of this macro loss of narrative. It's feed yourself today, because tomorrow doesn't have very much meaning.
As you were talking there, I was meditating on the point you made earlier about there being the liberal conception of democracy that's been driving most of these things. And if anyone goes to read into liberalism and its contents and discontents, they will find that its drive is to free off anything that would stop you from achieving the utmost freedom to do whatever it is that you want. And with that, you get a dissolution of traditions, rights, customs, and also any story which might be potentially exclusionary, or all those things that we become so familiar with. And that takes me on to an article I read of an SDP party member, Rod Liddle, in The Spectator recently, where he started to talk about the dissatisfaction of the British populace with the recent prime ministers. He said, Keir Starmer, most unpopular prime minister on record. Before that, Boris Johnson. Oh no, so before that, Rishi Sunak. Before that, Liz Truss. Before that, Boris Johnson. Before that, Theresa May. And it's just kept on reaching new lows. He said, there's something wrong with all these people, but there's something wrong with us. And I did bridle at that a little bit, insofar as I thought, well, I agree, but also they represent something that no one particularly wants. But just trying to link this to the point you're talking about having a lack of narrative, is that maybe there is something wrong with us, but maybe that thing that's been wrong with us has effectively been that we have been denuded of all the things that make meaning. And so everything, like you say, that is getting put in front of us seems like it is not going to be particularly inspiring. It's not going to fix the issues that we can see, whether it's things you've mentioned, the rising crime, the lack of belonging, or a decreasing belonging, because the demographic changes are just so great, whether it's the continual diminishing of your own home culture and history, which I would say at this point has been so denuded of any meaning that people don't really know what it is. I mean, I had to learn it myself, basically, in my 20s. And that symbolism you're talking about, just lacking around any narrative. And I know I'm flipping from Britain to the EU here, but just as a interesting anecdote is, I remember being in Berlin, I think I was 2017 or something, and I found myself sitting on one of the main squares in the city centre, and there was this pro-EU rally on, and basically on the stage that had been erected, there was the European Union flag, and they had Beethoven's Ode to Joy playing, which is the anthem of the EU, and there's just lots of people dancing around in a circle holding hands. But I say lots of people, it was just a few people who were there doing the organising, and lots of people staring on quizzically at the stage, and there was lots of exhortations, come and get involved, and no one did, because it looked bizarre. And even me at that point, who was pretty staunch Remainer and quite a progressive liberal, I was looking on at that going, this seems utterly uninspiring. And bringing it back to Britain, I've found myself reading a whole bunch of books recently that were written around wartime that are talking about the history of the nation. One of them, Arthur Bryant's Makers of the Realm, and the first chapter, he is talking about the industriousness of the Saxon. He's talking about the type of island that they came to, and the things that they did, and how over time all of the institutions were built alongside and through conflict and cooperation with the Celtic fringe, and how that true diversity kind of worked. And you don't get any of that anymore. No one even really has an understanding of that. And I imagine at some point in the past, around that time, maybe before the Cultural Revolution hit education, which Peter Hitchens would talk about, that people did actually know their history. They I'm not talking about, jingoistic, everyone's just on message, just all for whatever the elites did in the past. There would have been dissenters, of course, but people would have known the history of the country and felt like they were a part of something, whereas now I feel like people's roots have been pulled out. And so, to get back to the Rod Liddle point, I think there is something wrong with this, but I think it's because it's been forced upon us through all of the state activity and the private sector activities that's taken place over the last 50, 60 years. But would you agree with that, or is that just the ramblings of a madman?
No, not at all. Not at all. I think I agree with it in total. One of the things that strikes me as you're talking, so I've lived in Ealing in West London for 35 years now. I've lived in London most of my life. I think for the most part, it's a wonderful part of the country, part of the world to live in. But I found myself at a party last Christmas and talking to the mother of an ex-school mate of my son's, and she was from Spain. And she said, well, in Spain we have an extremely strong sense of culture, sense of national identity, symbolic resources, to use that phrase again. And she said, I've lived in England for 10 or 15 years, always in Ealing. And this is not about her. This is about what she's found. And she said, I don't know what British culture is. I don't know what English culture is, because it doesn't exist before my eyes. I never hear about it. Does it really exist? And I found myself quite. It was quite hard to say. Well. In fact, on one level, it was very easy to say, yes, there is a sense. Let's limit to England for a little while. There is a huge English folklore, aside from literature and so on, folk singing, local customs, and so on. And they still exist. I think they're under the cosh at the moment, even in their own, as it were, natural environments. But somewhere like London, which is so predominant, has effectively ejected all sense of connection with its hinterland. And so unless this Spanish family chose to immerse itself through, I don't know, getting into a car and immersing itself in English country life or provincial life, or pubs and local town squares and so on, it would have no sense of it. It's not transmitted into the city. And I think this is obviously one of the trends that there's been: the urbanization, the heterogeneity within those cities. Whether it's happened naturally through, very, very large scale movements of populations and so on, or whether actually at the margin it has been deliberately done, the deliberate forgetting of history, deliberate cutting off from customs, a deliberate denigration, because they're seen somehow to be in the past, they're somehow seen to be unhelpful towards a larger universalist ideal. And I think one of the secrets of the future, is a systematic rediscovery of that. First and foremost, by those who are themselves practicing it, but somehow a retransmission even into these deracinated cities, so that it's impossible for this, let's say, this particular individual, a dear friend, to say it's been lost. Now, she chose to link it to the spiritual side of things. She identifies that Britain is further ahead of Spain in losing a sense of faith, which she says strongly underpins a national culture, a local identity. Which to me is ironic in itself, because let's say Christianity is a universalist creed. It is for everyone. But I think that there's a way in which, in the past, it has been able to, and still today, it's been able to support, nurture, enrich, and give permission to local expression of culture and a local pride without it becoming exclusionary, to those who don't happen to belong to it. So maybe these are the ramblings of another madman. But those are some of the reflections that come to me from somebody's individual comment, and a sense of, I don't know, regret on my part that I wasn't able to say, you just haven't noticed. Just look over there. You will find a huge richness. But there's a bafflement to preventing it.
Yes. Well, when I had a conversation with David Stark here earlier on in the year, he said, well, whenever any visitors come to England, he takes them to a parish church and he takes them to the nearest cathedral so they can have that sense of history and all the rest of it. And he himself, as a non-believer, says that when he enters these places, he does feel something, but he feels the historical attachment to the Englishmen that have gone before, the people that have built this place, that have prayed in this place, and that usually these places have been these core locations for either just the quiet lives of faith, or really big things like the Temple Church in London being the place that Magna Carta was spun out of, that the Declaration of Independence ended up being spun out of. Those kinds of people frequenting it, and Christianity and the way it melded with the English culture, which is unique, and which someone like Alan McFarlane will show people as unique as an anthropologist,
yes,
have melded with the culture and turned it into our very own code by which we live, and it's informed everything from our rights and our duties and obligations and laws and all of those things. So I do find that the commercialization of the Southeast in particular really has hollowed out quite a lot of that. I've lived down there myself, and I've got family that live down there as well. And I think to a great extent, a lot of daily life is keeping up with the Joneses, and there's lots of greasy pole climbing on the corporate ladder for those who are within that percentage of the population who are doing that, or it's just a Neil Postman entertaining ourselves to death kind of thing, and there's no sense of the city that that people are walking around and what it's about, and the people who built it. It's now just badged as, by the current mayor, a global city, and it's open to everyone, which then kind of means it belongs to no one. But if you do that, then you're unable to really get under the skin of those things. And so you have newcomers like the Spaniard you've mentioned come, and they've got absolutely no sense of what's going on because they've got people in positions of power saying it's everyone's and everyone built it. And we're running around busy with an Outlook calendar trying to fill up our bank accounts, which I do think is definitely more of a southeastern thing, and it's kind of sucked in a lot of the periphery as well. Places in Kent, they've become commuter towns, whereas Kent itself has its own rich history and local people that have been inspiring through time and who've been whatever. There's all these places you can go and see, but we're just not really aware of it. And it's a great shame. And I think you're right. Something does need to be reinvigorated. You're talking about reseeding the cities with people who have that sense. But I was invited recently to an event next month about the state of education and how things need to change and this, that, and the other. And it's cross-party. And I kind of have a sense that it's going to be a lot about get the grades back up and improve literacy and numeracy. But I do think we need something more than that, I feel like someone with great vision, and you spoke to me about this at a friend's birthday party recently, needs to come along and actually start creating schooling that is in that classical Christian sense, which is basically what everyone was taught from after the Great Literacy Boom, or according to following the Great Literacy Boom, and give people a sense of what the nation is, who built it, but also all of those things which people have had imparted upon them through Western civilization, which built it, helped them understand the water in which they swim. we need that kind of vision, that kind of King Alfred vision, like that school you pointed me to
Yes.
do it, because no one seems to do it. Everyone's just tinkering around in that technocratic mindset, like, let's fiddle around with the spreadsheets and how do we get better outcomes and better pay and this, that, and the other. That's fine. It's great. It's important, but it can't be the only thing, because again, it gets back to that whole denuded of meaning.
No, yes. Again, I completely I completely agree with you. I think one of the challenges, I mean, maybe back to the contemporary political scene a little bit, and the and the loss of narrative. One of the things I observe with great interest, obviously, is the development of Reform UK as a party. Moving from being a protest party about one issue to now trying to position itself as a government in waiting. And I think I'm speaking for myself. I think that the traditional old two-party system needs not just a good spanking, it needs absolutely shattering so that it can never reform into the hegemony that it has so undeservedly held. Latterly at one point, it was, I think, a reasonably worthy structure, but I just don't think it can hold anymore. And one of the questions one of the observations I would make, and one of the reasons I'm in the party I'm in, I suppose, is the essential question. How do you factor in the value of community without reducing it to yet just another, as it were, economic or commercially exploitable concept? So that it's not just like a heritage thing, which is another marketing gimmick. How do you make it real? And I think one of the, without necessarily going into a big thing about this, one of the whilst there were, I think, a number of upsides during the necessary upsides, let's say, during the Thatcher era, it utterly lost sight of the value of communities, the value of social cohesion. And there was a lot of despoliation that went on that we are still recovering from. So, to the extent that that was a governmental manifestation of very much free market ideology, I do think there needed to be an economic corrective to what had gone before. But it was like throwing out the baby with the bathwater. At the other end of things, and again being slightly simplistic about this, you've got once more quite a Marxist narrative, which is, because of the economic dispossession and the fact that the new rising generations really don't have the economic prospects, let alone the social environment in which to thrive. That's becoming increasingly attractive. Neither of those poles, I think, represent the solution, because I don't think either of them really gets what the richness of community is about, the richness of belonging, the richness of identity, rooted identity. And I'm convinced you can achieve such a sense of identity without becoming nationalistic to the point of jingoistic, to the point of aggressively exclusionary. And I think that's why I think it's worth striving for. So I do hope that whichever political force has the greatest power as the next election hoves into view, and I still don't think it's that obvious what the electoral landscape is going to look like when the next election comes in. There are so many variables at play, but I would be absolutely devastated if the next government effectively defaulted to being a very free market, price of everything, value of nothing construct. And one of my hope is that there's enough discourse of the sort that we're having, this micro conversation, but writ large at a national level, to make sure that new political movements don't miss the opportunity to put community, to put families, to put the richness of society more broadly at the heart of their program.
Well, that's probably a good segue into how traditional cleavages within politics and the landscape have broken down. So before I ask you that question to unpack is where you were talking about the hope that we don't effectively just go down a let's go full free market liberalism once again, uh, referring, of course, to our past with that. Thatcher did some good things as Prime Minister, but the things which you and your party leader, William Clouston, will say were not so good was look at the price of deindustrialisation. We might have got some more cheap goods, but look at the wreckages that were left behind in our post-industrial towns and cities, and they are there for all to see for anyone who bothers to go and look at them. And if you don't want to go and look at them, look at the data with regards to joblessness and all the rest of it.
Yes.
It's really not good. And also, then you just got to look at our national assets. We've sold an awful lot of them off. Our businesses have been sold off to American conglomerates. There really isn't that much family silver left. So if we continue on down that route, it feels like it's just going to be a continual scraping of the barrel. And what we'll get is, and I'll bring in Paul Embury as an example, is more of these microcosms that he described in Despised as a man from Dagenham, Barking and Dagenham, where he watched in the course of his life through free market policies, which was about free movement of labour and effectively open borders, his whole community just disappear over time, move out further east, and a whole demographic move in and start taking in jobs with whatever industry was remaining. And we'll just have more of that because we're trying to get lines on the graph go up. So with that in mind, Paul Embury, he's a Labour man. He has for many years been a bit of a voice in the wilderness there as the Labour Party became less a party of the working class and more a party of the liberal metropolitan. And the Tories, if we're talking about two-party politics, have typically always represented the high-income, well-heeled, leafy parts of Great Britain. All of that seems to have broken down. Stephen, describe how it's broken down, and I suppose where we think party loyalty is headed.
Yes. So, yes, you use the term cleavage politics, which is effectively the point, the politics of political affiliation. You know, who in political structures represents me and those like me, or those with my aspirations, or those with my backgrounds. And the old, back to the Gilbert and Sullivan song, there's a famous Gilbert and Sullivan song that people are either born a little conservative or they're born a little liberal. I can't sing it to you, but you know, it was an immutable law that you'd be one of those two tribes. And you know, unfair and unrepresentative and elitist though both of those tribes were, they at least were identifiable. They had identity markers and group characteristics. Okay, deeply stratified, but yes, so they did. And I think that's all gone. There are many academic papers and researches that tend in the same general direction. The idea of an emergence of a new elite, which is characterized particularly by those who have had higher education. Okay, it's maybe an increasing proportion of people, but it still forms into an elite. So it's the educated in some senses versus the non-educated. That is not just a British thing, that is a Europe-wide, maybe West-wide phenomenon. Generational divides, which I think are becoming exacerbated, hugely exacerbated with each generation that's rising. You know, I'm broadly part of one of the generations which has had it extremely good. I was growing up, I was born in the 1960s, late 60s, you know, and although I part of my coming of age was the 1983, you know, nuclear scares and so on, and the two tribes go to war era. You know, it was relatively peaceful, relatively prosperous, blips up and down and so on, you know, in very, very broad terms and so on. But the new generations just cannot hope to get on the same ladders that I was able to get on. So I think there is a big generational divide. And part of that generational divide is that with the influence of education, in fact, as you were talking about earlier, it's much more, as it were, transnational. It's much less rooted. The sort of orientation is towards ideologically transnational issues, which I think is a big change compared to previous generations. We've already talked about the city-rural divide, which has broken cleavages. And also ethnic diversity. So political affiliations have changed a great deal with the change in demographics. So in short, I quite like this term. There's been the emergence of what Piketty, in a paper with others, called the Brahmin left. The sort of privileged class that actually, as Joel Kotkin argues, is creating a new hereditary elite where offspring are born with silver spoons in their mouths because they have the means in which to perpetuate their own predominance. So the Brahmin left. There is a so-called merchant right, a much smaller constituency, which is let's call it broadly I mean it's a simplistic characterization, but those who've achieved through commerce, through banking, through their own entrepreneurialism, and there's nothing wrong with all of that, but forming a new elite. And then I think there's a vast grouping of people who don't belong to either of those, but for whom traditional Labour, conservative, let's say Liberal Democrats in there somewhere, and then you've also got the progressive parties of the SNP and Plaid Cymru, for instance, who just do not represent vast numbers of people on the right and the left, which are labels I don't particularly like. Who are the contra of that. They're not so well educated. They tend to be the younger people. Lots of them tend to be on the more from the outside the cities and so on. Who feel that there's no there's no cleavage that works for them. And that's where I think part of my answer to the question, is democracy working, is the absolute blossoming of new movements. There's a phrase that's used for these of these groupings, movement parties. Often, they are mass movements that have grown up about a single issue, whether it's on the left or the right, whether it might be ecological concerns or it might be about displaced demographics. And these movements growing up, sometimes they're aligned to a political party, or sometimes there's an alliance between a movement and a sort of an understanding. And I look at this and I think that represents a very vibrant manifestation of democracy, but it isn't along the lines of the traditional cleavages. And none of those new groupings really have their hands on the levers of power, because the barrier to entry into real political power, whether it's the first past the post system in Britain or other, as you referred to quite a bit earlier, ways in which new groupings can be excluded from the democratic environment. If they want to create new effective electoral cleavages, these people, that is their yearning. And the elites are wanting, I think, slightly too readily to say, no, these movements are a bit outre. They need to be placed outside the democratic perimeter. We don't really want them in here because we fear what they're going to do. So I think it's a fascinating, like, gigantic laboratory experiment. I mean, the stakes are incredibly high, obviously, so you can't take it too lightly. But I think part of one of the things that will decide the extent to which the next 10, 15, 20 years happen largely peacefully, I think, will depend on the extent to which these elites, the Brahmin elites, to an extent the merchant elite, embraces those they would rather not have anywhere near them, and certainly wouldn't want to be fellow parliamentarians with them, for instance.
You made an allusion to, look, we've got in the next 10 or 15 years, if we want to avoid things getting nasty, to paraphrase, we're going to have to find a way to bridge the gap between the elites and the demos, because there are lots of people, whether it's David Betts talking about the reality about potential civil war,
Yes.
or Peter Turchin in his book End Times, where he has researched history to show that as the gap grows between elites and the demos to a certain extent, and there's no going back, then it ends in some kind of conflict. And it's only once the conflict's been had that things start to get back to normal. So presumably no one really wants to go and get their pitchforks out and take to the streets. I would quite like to avoid it if possible. So Stephen, what has to happen for our current crop of elites to bridge the gap between them and what the demos clearly want but keep being told they shouldn't because they're all a bit stupid?
Yes. So I think first and foremost it is dialogue and recognition. So that's a very woolly phrase. Just to return to the point I just made, I think it is absolutely essential that the elites do not attempt to cast on the outside of the democratic perimeter these very large groupings, because otherwise they will just have no recourse but to, as you say, the pitchfork. I would say actually there are some for whom their first preference is now the pitchfork, and I think we're in a very unstable equilibrium, if equilibrium we can even call it anymore. So I don't think we've got very much time. But I just to close on that point, yes, very much. But I think also these movement parties, which is what I have in mind when I'm saying this, they owe it also to make themselves serious propositions, not protest parties, so that actually that they prove themselves to be valuable in the electoral space, because there is a tangible seriousness about their intent to govern properly. Intent to govern properly. I mean, without making too many pointed observations, it was interesting to see the Your Party launch, which is a different part of the political spectrum to mine, but it is a legitimate movement. But it managed to give a very passable impression of a self-parodying comedy about parties on the left at its launch event. I would say there's a long way to go before it presents itself seriously, and as it were, deserves its place. That's a loaded term, but deserves its place within electoral politics. But I want to just touch on two or three maybe areas. I think that I've said this already. Being honest with the electorate is absolutely critical. There has been too much dishonesty, which is no longer tenable. It is manifestly no longer tenable. So I don't quite know how that's going to happen. I would very much want it to happen organically within democratic politics, that political voices, I would say ours, obviously, come to the fore with proper, rooted, coherent policies and propositions that aren't a sleight of hand, that just aren't a sleight of hand. There are people who are convinced that this country is technically bankrupt already, and that whatever people say, we're going to slide into anarchy, but not least for economic reasons, let alone socio-political incoherence. But I want to say it's not too late to return to honesty. that would mean some quite difficult adjustments. A reorientation towards investment away from quick fixes in consumption. It's something that Labour, I think, is congenitally unable to do now. It is congenitally unable to say, we have to find a way to reorient ourselves towards future benefits away from current consumption. And such basic things as energy and other fundamentals to our security. On that point, on these points, I think one of the themes that emerged from my research and my thinking was this idea about national interest as one of the as a way of recognizing the demos, as a way of representing the sort of politics around the demos. Because if you don't have the interest of the nation, national interest at heart, and that's not necessarily in foreign policy, but it's about domestic security, it's about cohesion, social cohesion, and so on. If you don't have something that gravitates towards that, and I don't see anything in Labour's political programme that's heading towards sectarianism and not towards national identity and national cohesion, for instance. It's a fool's errand to think that democratic politics really can provide the answer. So I've talked around several themes. I feel as if I've circled it a little bit, but let me close in on this point of national interest. I think to be serious in politics and to present democratic solutions, there has to be a rediscovery of a real national interest, and that's not an ethno-nationalist thing. It's not a heading in that direction at all. It is saying, for a people to thrive, these are the minimum conditions that are needed economically, socially, culturally.
On that note, what I will do, though, just to add on the ethno-cultural point, is I was just speaking to Paul Morland and Eric Kaufman yesterday. That episode will come out a week from ours, and we were talking about the demographics of the country and those Office for National Statistics data and projections that came out and said by the mid-2060s, Britain will be a minority white British country. England will be before then because of the state of demographic change. I would actually argue that somewhere in the national interest, we probably do want to have a consideration for what that might look like, because all of the things we've talked about with regards to history, one, we know nations are built from a people, and it's not to say that ethnic group is fixed. It's not, and it never has been through history. There's always been changes around the edges, and we've seen that in this country over that time. But ethnic groups, they've got culture, they've got their own signs and symbols and all the rest of it, and all the things we've spoken about, like how the English and the British peoples have used Christianity to build their own societies. The reality is, if we are headed into a future where the white British are going to end up being a minority, and we can already see through the large diasporas that are growing that they are not necessarily signed up to the same way of life. So whether it's the various religious law courts that have popped up around the place, like, there is just some quite clearly obvious things that suggest that's not in the national interest. And so I actually do think we're probably headed toward a point where, for instance, talking with Paul and Eric, it was, what do we do about this? Well, they were talking about, you really do just want to stop immigration. I know SDP say, look, we need to cease that. We need to basically blunt the curve. There needs to be some more thinking on this, because if we want England or Britain to remain anything recognisably English and British, you're going to need a majority of those people, and we can argue on the percentages, to be of that ethnic group, because ethnic groups carry culture. And
Yes.
if we suddenly end up having with even larger ones around, we'll just become more like those cultures. And if everyone decides that's what they want, well, that's what they want. But I don't think they will do that. And that's why I think we need to smuggle that in somewhere, because that will inform immigration policy, it'll inform citizenship policy, it'll inform benefits and welfare state and all the rest of it. And that will all have a tangible impact to avoid that future, which, putting my neck on the line here, I don't want that future.
Yes, so I agree with that as an absolute minimum. I mean, the longest standing of the party's policies on ending mass immigration is the SDPs. It's very good to see other parties finally catching on. We do see we do see absolutely the need for a societal cohesion based on that common heritage, which has been which is fundamentally bequeathed to those whose forebears were there. Britain has been a very, very generous country when it comes to welcoming in other groupings in proportions and with degrees of let's say inherent compatibility of outlook and worldview, where there can be, to use a loaded term these days, an assimilation over time. And I think until very recently, there was an ambient flow that allowed for that. It has got obviously completely out of control over the last 30, 35 years. And so I think this is where this national interest comes in again. It's not an economic thing; it is a socio-cultural thing. About normal expectations. And I think there need to be several waves of this. There are some basic things. I personally, for instance, would be against the very existence of Sharia law courts. I think it's anathema to the fundamental settlement of being equal under the law, about the law treating everyone the same. So that's one example, and that would be a very that and other considerations which are sort of bolt-ons of a sectarian future. Anything that is necessary to avoid the baking in of a sectarian future are obviously going to be very, very necessary. But I think through that will then need to come a generation-long, as it were, education a campaign, together with enforcements and together with certain restrictions, which bring about a more of an alignment, and not just expectations but requirements that people conform. I think that the next year or two is seeing very lively public debate. It already is, about what the nature of that is. But I think I would still say again, a policy based purely on ethno-nationalist grounds wouldn't actually yield the future that those who are advocates of it would want, I think, because there would be so many perverse consequences to it. The cure would be worse than the condition as a result of it.
Oh, no doubt. And there is absolutely no reason to try to move towards in my opinion, the pretty outlandish position of someone like Steve Laws. It just effectively keep the Browns out. It is that is not where this needs to go. But I think understanding that there's an ethno-cultural core, and you really do want to retain that. Not out of an animus, but out of a recognition of human nature and society.
Yes.
But this conversation, as you pointed out, is ongoing, and it's all coming out in the wash. So I'm going to let you go. But before I do, I'm going to ask you the question I ask all of my guests, which is, what have you changed your mind on during the course of your life that you perhaps thought was a fundamental cornerstone of the universe? You weren't going to change your mind on it, and then what was it that made you think differently? And maybe there wasn't one of those things. Maybe it was something day to day.
Yes, I mean, So I studied economics at university. I was an economist by training. And I don't mind saying this was in the 1980s, 86 to 89. I would have been very much on the free market end of politics. The Big Bang in the City in 1987 or thereabouts. And I think I wasn't quite a sort of Friedmanite or whatever fully, but I think one of the things that has changed me. I happen to be a Catholic Christian, so body of wisdom called Catholic social teaching, which is fundamentally about how we relate to our neighbour. This personal morality, but how you associate and how you look after, make sure everyone is looked after. As it were, imbued in me a conscience, which I think took me on a journey which I wasn't so very aware of. We've always been, individually charitable, giving to charity, helping out in community, and so on. So I've done my bit, but I think it's only very, very latterly that's crystallized into this this deep political question about how to value a community without the means to price it. And I think, to me, if there's a big, as it were, political idea, I'm putting it probably quite clumsily, and there are far cleverer and more articulate people than I can who could articulate it and maybe deconstruct it as well. But I think that's where I am now. It's not a radical individualism and a sort of trickle down thing that that was popular in the 1980s, because I think it is an absolutely unsustainable and impoverished, as it were, politico-economic creed. So I suppose that's what I would say. Personal conviction in there as well.
Thank you for sharing that. It was clearly personal. Stephen, it's been an absolute pleasure to welcome you on the show, and looking forward to more conversations in the future. Keep fighting the good fight.
Well, that's kind of you, John. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Stephen.